In the end, in the unforgiving death zone, above 24,000 feet, the mountain always claims victory over the weak and exhausted. With sweat drenching their bodies and their legs aching from the grueling ascent, Hannelore and her team reached the summit. However, against the strong protests of their Sherpas, they made a daring move and decided to set up camp in the treacherous death zone, where the air is thin and the altitude a staggering 28,000 feet. Taking a calculated risk, they settled in for the night, not knowing what horrors the mountain may have in store for them. Will Hannelore be strong enough to persevere, or will she succumb to the mountain's merciless grasp? Hello, and welcome to this video about the incredible journey of Hannelore Schmatz, one of the few women who have successfully climbed Mount Everest. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into her journey to the top of the world's highest peak. Heads up, for our next video, we'll be delving into the tale of a Canadian woman mountaineer and her fateful ascent of Mount Everest. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you're interested in catching that video as well. Hannelore Schmatz was a German mountaineer who had a passion for climbing. She started her journey as a climber in her 20s, and over the years, she climbed several challenging peaks in Europe and South America. Her love for climbing and adventure eventually led her to the Himalayas, where she set her sights on climbing the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. In 1979, at the age of 39, Hannelore accomplished the remarkable feat of becoming the fourth woman globally to reach the summit of Mount Everest. Sadly, her triumphant ascent to the top of the mountain would be her final climb. Only the most skilled climbers on Earth dare to face the dangerous conditions associated with the climb to the top of Everest. Hannelore and her husband Gerhard Schmatz were seasoned mountaineers who had already conquered some of the world's most challenging peaks. In May 1973, Hannelore and Gerhard returned from a successful expedition to the summit of Manaslu, the eighth highest mountain in the world located in Nepal, standing at 26,781 feet above sea level. Undeterred, they immediately set their sights on their next adventure. For unknown reasons, the couple decided to attempt to climb the world's highest mountain, Mount Everest. They applied for a permit to climb the deadly peak from the Nepalese government and began their intense preparation. Hannelore and Gerhard Schmatz were seasoned mountaineers who took on the challenge of climbing the world's highest peak. Over the years, they climbed higher mountains to acclimate themselves to higher altitudes. After climbing Lhotse, the fourth highest mountain, in 1977, they received approval for their expedition to Mount Everest. Hannelore, known for her expertise in obtaining and organizing expedition supplies, took charge of the technical and logistical preparation for the journey. In the 1970s, obtaining proper climbing equipment in Kathmandu was a challenge. As a result, Hannelore Schmatz and her team had to have all the gear they needed for their 3-month ascent of Everest shipped from Europe to Nepal. Hannelore took charge of securing a warehouse in Nepal to store their equipment, which weighed several tons in total. In addition to the equipment, the team had to be assembled, and besides Hannelore and Gerhard, there were 6 other highly skilled high-altitude climbers that joined the expedition to Everest's summit. The 8-member climbing team consisted of Hannelore and Gerhard Schmatz, along with Nick Banks, Hans von Cannel, Ray Jennett respectively from New Zealand, Switzerland, and the US, and 3 fellow German climbers, Tilman Fischbach, Gunter Feitz and Hermann Worth. Hannelore was the only female member of the group. The team was accompanied by 5 local Himalayan mountain guides known as Sherpas to help them navigate the trek. They began their journey in July 1979 after everything was fully prepared. During their ascent, the climbers reached an altitude of approximately 24,606 feet, known as the Yellow Band. They continued along the Geneva Spur until they reached the South Col, a sharp ridge located at the lowest point between Lhotse and Everest and situated at an altitude of 26,200 feet. On September 24, 1979, the group set up their final high camp at the South Col. The climb was disrupted by a multi-day blizzard, causing everyone to retreat back to Camp 3. When they resumed the ascent, they split into 2 groups, with Hannelore in one group with other climbers and 2 Sherpas, while Gerhard was in the other. Gerhard's group arrived at the South Col first after a 3-day climb, and they set up camp for the night. Reaching the South Col marked the beginning of the final phase of their ascent to the top of Everest. While Hannelore Schmatz's group was still trying to make it back to the South Col, Gerhard Schmatz and his group set out early on October 1, 1979 to continue their ascent towards the peak of Mount Everest. Gerhard's group reached the south summit of Everest around 2 p.m., and Gerhard became the oldest person to reach the summit of the world's highest mountain at the age of 50. The team celebrated, but Gerhard noted the dangerous conditions from the south summit to the peak, describing the challenges they faced on the climb in a description on his website. Due to the steepness and the bad snow conditions, the kicks break out again and again. The snow is too soft to reach reasonably reliable levels and too deep to find ice for the crampons. How fatal that is, can then be measured, if you know that this place is probably one of the most dizzying in the world. Gerhard's group quickly made their way back down the mountain, facing the same difficulties they encountered during the ascent. When Gerhard's group returned safely to the South Col camp that evening, Hannelore's group, who arrived at around the same time as Gerhard had reached the summit of Everest, had already set up camp for their own ascent to the top. Gerhard and the other members of his group warned Hannelore and the rest about the unfavorable snow and ice conditions, but Hannelore was determined to reach the summit and was not swayed by their warning. Gerhard described her as being indignant about the suggestion to not continue the climb. At 5 a.m., Hannelore Schmatz and her team started their ascent from the South Col towards the summit of Mount Everest. Meanwhile, her husband Gerhard was making his way down to the Camp 3 base as the weather conditions were getting worse. At around 6 p.m., Gerhard received a report over the expedition's walkie-talkie that his wife had successfully reached the summit with the rest of the group. Hannelore became the 4th woman to conquer the top of Everest. However, Hannelore's return was plagued by hazards. According to the remaining members of the group, both Hannelore and American climber Ray Jennett, who were strong climbers, became too exhausted to continue and wanted to take a break and set up a bivouac camp before continuing their descent. Sherpas Sungdare and Ongjongbu, who were with Hannelore and Jennett, warned against their decision. They were in the middle of what was known as the death zone, where conditions were so dangerous that climbers were most likely to die. The Sherpas advised the climbers to push on to reach the base camp further down the mountain. However, Ray Jennett, who was also one of the climbers, reached his limit and remained there, eventually succumbing to hypothermia. The remaining climbers, including Hannelore, were deeply affected by the loss of their comrade, and decided to continue their descent. However, Hannelore's body was already starting to be impacted by the harsh conditions. Her last words, according to the Sherpa who was with her, were, "Water, water," as she sat down to take a rest. She passed away, resting against her backpack. One of the Sherpas stayed with her body and suffered from frostbite, losing a finger and toes. Hannelore Schmatz was the first woman and the first German to die on the slopes of Everest. Fatigue is one of the major causes of death on Mount Everest. Climbers become too exhausted due to the physical and mental strain, lack of oxygen, or excessive energy expenditure during the climb, which results in lack of coordination, confusion, and disorientation. This can also cause internal bleeding in the brain, exacerbating the situation. In the case of Hannelore, exhaustion and confusion likely played a role in her death. Despite the knowledge that it would be better to head to base camp, she felt compelled to take a break, which ultimately proved fatal. In the death zone, above 24,000 feet, the mountain always triumphs if a climber is too weak to carry on. For many years, Hannelore Schmatz's frozen body could be seen by climbers attempting to reach the summit of Everest via the southern route. Her remains were in a seated position, leaning against her backpack with her eyes open and hair blowing in the wind, about 330 feet above Camp 4. During a 1981 expedition, Sungdare Sherpa, who had previously lost his fingers and toes during the 1979 climb, acted as a guide again, but only after being paid extra by climber Chris Kopczynski. As they passed Hannalore's body on their descent, Chris was shocked and thought it was a tent, but they did not touch it. Chris later reported seeing Hannelore still wearing her watch. Lena Gammelgaard, the first Scandinavian woman to reach the summit of Everest, quoted the Norwegian mountaineer and expedition leader, Arne Næss Jr. in her book, Climbing High, A Woman's Account of Surviving the Everest Tragedy, which recounts her own 1996 expedition. In the book, Næss described his encounter with Hannelore Schmatz's remains as follows. "It's not far now. I can't escape the sinister guard. About 300 feet above Camp 4, she sits leaning against her backpack, as if taking a short break. Her eyes are wide open and her hair waves in each gust of wind. This is the corpse of Hannelore Schmatz, the wife of the leader of a 1979 German expedition. She reached the summit but died on the descent. Yet it feels like she's watching me as I pass by. Her presence serves as a reminder that we are here at the mercy of the mountain." In 1984, an attempt was made by a Sherpa and a Nepalese police inspector to retrieve Hannelore Schmatz's remains, but both individuals perished in the process. After this unsuccessful attempt, Hannelore's body was eventually swept away by wind, causing it to fall over the edge of the Kangshung face, where it was never seen again and was ultimately claimed by the mountain's harsh elements. Thank you for watching this video about Hannelore Schmatz and her journey to Mount Everest. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and amazing adventures. Until next time, keep exploring the world and never stop chasing your dreams.